Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Book Passage. My name is Allison Bainbridge, and it is a great honor to introduce this author for a special event tonight, celebrating the book, The Language of God, from someone who is described as a national treasure. I was talking to him for a few minutes. I can tell he's very humble, so probably it makes him a little uncomfortable to be known as a national treasure. Francis Collins. By listing his accomplishments, it sounds like I'm introducing four different people. He's a physician, a geneticist, an author, and the former director of the National Institutes of Health. In 1993, he was appointed director of the International Human Genome Project, which successfully sequenced all 3 billion letters of our DNA. He went on to serve 3 presidents as a director of the National Institutes of Health. Thank you for your service, I just want to say. Dr. Collins has created a deeply thoughtful guidebook to get us beyond societal divisions and back to the sources of wisdom. I was going to say, my brother actually is a scientist and has focused his last 20 years of his career in teaching science communication. He and I have had many conversations about how important it is to teach scientists how to communicate with us lay people so that we understand the pivotal research that is going on in areas that affect us. However, lately it appears that it's more than a manner. There's more than just effective communication that we need to be able to understand here. The language of God is the moral, philosophical, and scientific framework with which to address the problems of our time, including distrust of public health, partisanship, racism, response to climate change, and threats to our democracy, but also to guide us in our daily lives. Former President Bill Clinton says that through his leadership of the Human Genome Project, Dr. Collins revealed the simple truth that we are all far more alike than we are different. Now, in his thoughtful book, The Road to Wisdom, he urges us to have the courage and humility to bridge our divides, embrace what we have in common, and rebuild a fractured society. When Dr. Collins speaks, I listen. I think we all need to listen, as his message is more important now than ever. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Francis Collins.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. Good evening, everybody. Nice to see all of you here at Book Passages, and hello to the people who are watching virtually, because I gather there's quite a bunch of folks there also. I thought I would say a little bit about the book, but I'm looking forward to the chance to hear from you. So we'll have time for some questions and hopefully answers, or efforts to be providing answers. And that will be available both to the people who are here live and the people who are live on the video. So it's been 18 years since I've written a book. You mentioned The Language of God. That came out in 2006. And now here we are in 2024 with another one. And it's a book about this road to wisdom, which probably means we should talk for a minute about what is wisdom anyway. It is more than knowledge, although it requires knowledge. Wisdom takes knowledge, which has to be reliable, and then adds to that insight, understanding, judgment, and very importantly, a moral foundation. Knowledge itself doesn't always have a moral foundation, it just is. But wisdom takes you to that next level. And I think it's something we all strive for, whether we're thinking about it or not. I like this metaphor that we're all on a road. I'm on the road with you, trying to figure out how to get more of this wisdom that Solomon said to God was the thing that he wanted as a gift. Not riches, not a fine palace, wisdom. But we don't always succeed. And I must say, for me, over the course of a lifetime, I've often felt like I hit a bump, or maybe even I ended up in the ditch because something just completely threw me where I thought I was on that path and then I wasn't. Again, the difference between wisdom and knowledge is probably something we should focus on in the course of this conversation. And one way to think about it is, if you want to be a science fiction person, think of Spock, who is the rationalist. So Spock is knowledge, right? Yoda is the wisdom part. Yoda has a lot of knowledge too, but you add to that this other level. So why this book? Why now? Why this author? You might ask all those questions. I ask myself too. Well, I was inspired to write this after spending many years in the public eye. I've been a government employee, a public servant now for 31 years. I came first to the NIH to lead the Human Genome Project, as you heard. And then for 12 years after that was serving as the leader of this most significant biomedical research effort in the whole world, the National Institutes of Health. But I've been developing growing concern about how our growing societal polarization, which you can see around you, has begun to warp our thinking in 4 ways that maybe are getting in the way of making progress and getting in the way of that road to wisdom. And that includes our ability to discern truth, our understanding of science, our ability to apply the fundamentals of faith. I'm also a person of faith, and I'll say a bit more about that. And our insights about where to place our trust. All of those things are pretty important for a productive and stable society, and yet it feels like those anchors of truth, science, faith, and trust are maybe not so well placed right now. You can't look around very much without seeing the kind of divisiveness that seems to have affected us. So this is my humble attempt in this book to sort of unwarp us and try to see if we could recover some of these aspects of humanity, which I believe are pretty critical for our future. My book begins with a spectacular story of my own research failure, because I really want to try from the very beginning to say, I don't have all the answers here, and I've done a lot of things that turned out badly. So please don't take the somewhat presumptuous title of the book like The Road to Wisdom. He's going to tell us how to find our way to wisdom. No, I'm right there with you. That first effort as a trainee in molecular biology, I had a rather nonlinear pathway, starting out thinking I wanted to be a chemist, and then halfway through graduate school in physical chemistry, discovering that biology was actually interesting, which I didn't know, and getting particularly excited about molecular biology and DNA and RNA, and maybe something like this could actually turn into a revolution in medicine. I want to do that. So I transitioned into medical school. I learned that particular art and science. I got trained as an internal medicine doc, but then I had to figure out the research part. So that meant landing in a research lab with a bunch of very highly productive postdoctoral fellows and a mentor who was both the smartest person that I've ever had the chance to work with and the most difficult to understand. And I didn't really know, what am I supposed to do here? I'd have a conversation with him and he would give out 10 ideas and I was never quite sure, was I supposed to do one of those or was this just a conversation? And it was a joke because I really did not know how to do any of these experiments. And yet I was now finally given a project that, if it had worked, was going to be pretty exciting. It was developing a new way to propagate large pieces of DNA so you could study them, what you call cloning. And up at that point, the biggest pieces that people could work with were maybe 3,000 or 4,000 letters in the code. And you wanted at least 10 times that. And here was the way to do it. And I was like, I'm going to make this work. And so over 6 months, I slaved at this. And I made a lot of mistakes because I really didn't understand the experimental side very well. And things fell on the floor and I added the wrong buffer. All the things you could do that were wrong, I would do. But finally, the day came. It was like 6 months of this labor. And here was the definitive experiment. And it had taken me about 3 days. And here was going to be the answer. And I was going to have the result. And I was going to write a paper. And everybody's going to go, oh, I want to use what he came up with because it's so cool. And then the data was revealed. And it was a complete and utter unsalvageable disaster. There was a flawed premise in the whole experiment, something called bacterial recombination, which I had not studied enough or learned enough about. I just sort of had a good feeling that this is going to work. So I was pretty devastated. I went to my mentor after a long night of literally being tearful about this. And I said, I think I should probably leave the program. that I must not be cut out to do this. And he was like, oh, no, it happens. Let's find you another project. Well, I'm not sure I want another project. I went to my department chair who had recruited me to this program at Yale, somebody I greatly respected. And he said, let me tell you about my first failure. And he told me a fairly spectacular and similar example about his first real experiment, which had turned out really badly, and how he had learned so much from that, and how he thinks about that 30 or 40 years later when he's designing an experiment. Let's be rigorous here. Let's be sure that experiment is set up so that it actually has thought about all the ways it could fail and not just hoped it would turn out well. A very important lesson for a scientist. And then I went to my pastor, who happened to be a former NASA engineer. That was sort of helpful. And he sort of walked me through all of the leaders of the faith who over the course of time had plenty of their own failures and yet had learned from those and had kept going. I even found in Proverbs chapter 24, verse 16, for though the righteous fall 7 times, they rise again, but the wicked stumble when calamity strikes. I didn't want to be wicked. I wanted to be righteous. So I went on and I found another project, and that one happily started to work. I tell you this story because I think sometimes people think scientists who have achieved something, and I've been very fortunate to have a lot of doors open that I never had any expectation to do so, are somehow living a charmed life and everything's always gone perfectly and it's been so easy and straightforward. Everything just falls together. Believe me, it doesn't. Science is really hard. If you're doing anything that's really important, that means you're sort of out on the leading edge of what's possible. Your experiments are going to fail more often than they succeed. If you're going to tell me, well, my science is 100% successful, I'm going to say you're not doing anything very interesting because it's all so predictable. So maybe that's one of the myths about science I'm trying to address. But at the same time, if science does a set of experiments, comes up with an answer, reproduces it, other people test it out, and it's also reproducible, then it becomes part of this body of knowledge that society can depend upon. I am worried that what I just said is not at this point necessarily accepted by everybody, that there's some scientific conclusions that are almost immediately cast under suspicion for reasons that don't have much to do with the science. And I'll come back to that, particularly in the case of COVID in a little bit. So again, I tried to say wisdom, in my view, kind of seems to hang on truth, on science, on faith, and on trust. Let me just say a little bit about those 4 terms, and this is described in much more detail in the book. When we talk about truth, it's important to decide whether we believe in it. Is there such a thing as objective truth? There are certainly perspectives that would say not. The whole postmodernist view kind of proposed that maybe truth was really also subjective, that we shouldn't consider anything that way. That doesn't work when you go towards science that's studying how nature works. I don't know any postmodernist scientists. I don't know how you would do your job in that situation. So let's take as a given that there is such a thing as objective truth. And it doesn't care how you feel. It exists outside of us. It just is. The earth goes around the sun, not the other way around. The earth is actually spherical, slightly elliptical. It is not flat. There are thousands of people who belong to the Flat Earth Society who don't agree with that. I'm sorry. That's not productive. That is not the way that we're going to make future progress possible. But then there are other kinds of claims of truth that maybe aren't quite as rock solid. And I think the way we get in a lot of trouble about these arguments about truth is we haven't quite decided what is the category we're talking about. If it's mathematics, is 2 + 2 = 4? Yes, in any universe that's going to be true. If it's something about the nature of our universe that's been well established by science, like the Earth going around the sun, yeah, that is truth. That is objective. You can't really say that just isn't true for me. If it, on the other hand, is in this area of uncertainty, um, there's life on other planets. I don't know. There might be. We're discovering there are a lot of planets out there. Either there is or there isn't. We just don't know. So that would be an appropriate place for reasonable people to sort of put forward arguments pro or con, but nobody really will know the answer. And then, of course, there's opinion, where it's about what that movie was about, or one that happens at my house. Is it, in fact, a good idea for men to wear shoes that have brown leather tops and thick white soles? There is no agreement at our house about that. I won't tell you which opinion is mine. So the way we get in trouble with truth is either by saying none of this is actually true, so you can have whatever opinion you want. And that won't work when you're talking about history, for instance. Yes, there was a man on the moon in 1969. That's true. That's a fact. The other way we get in trouble is if people say everything I believe is true and you have to believe it too, including my opinions. We have to be more nuanced there. Think about those layers, those levels. And then in terms of science, what I learned from that first failure is that science can get things wrong, but if you get an answer that is then reproducible, that becomes trustworthy. Think back to my experience about reading those 3 billion letters of our human DNA instruction book. That was an amazing ride over the course of 13 years, although most of the work got done in the last year and a half. That's sort of how it happens. You build up all the technology and the capabilities to do things at scale, and then you're there. And we wanted to be sure we got it right. So I would insist that if this group over here was running sequence on that part of that chromosome, this group over here had to run the same experiment with their machines and see if they got the same answer. So you really knew whether the answer was reliable or not. Science needs to have that kind of rigor. For the most part, it does. And that means you can then trust the result, that when the Human Genome Project says we have accomplished this, you can use that data and trust it to be correct. And then what about faith? This book is written for believers, but also for non-believers. I'm trying to be as broad as possible in addressing people who are part of our society, many of whom I think are about as troubled as I am about what's happening to us. So maybe the people who are not believers will look at that chapter and go, why is that here? If you're not a believer, hopefully it'll give you a sense about where believers are coming from, because Christians especially are being so caricatured right now, unfortunately, by the mixing of religion and politics that has become really unfortunate and creates an image of most Christians as if they've somehow become purely political and lost their anchor to their foundation of loving your neighbor. So I am a person of faith. I didn't grow up that way. I grew up in a family where religion was not denigrated. It just wasn't practiced. It wasn't considered important. And I became a Christian as a medical student and a resident after watching terribly tragic circumstances of good, honorable people who were suffering from terrible medical conditions that we couldn't really fix, and wondering, what would I do? And how does this all make sense? And why am I here? And is there a God that has some role in all of this? And thinking that my atheism was going to be strengthened by answering those questions, I discovered my atheism was really completely useless in answering those questions. And over a couple of years, gradually coming to the sense that it was more rational to believe in God than to disbelieve, and then discovering the person of Jesus as an answer to so many questions I had about how I could possibly approach God and what is God like. But again, as a person of faith, when I look at where our faith communities are right now, I am quite troubled about how we should be out there leading in the space of pointing to truth and to love and to grace. And instead, many of our faith communities have been seduced, caught up by conspiracies, put into a circumstance of being on the back foot with fear about what's happening to their communities, to their faith, and not really being the way that I think we're called to, which is being the peacemakers, Blessed are the peacemakers. They will be called the children of God. That's what we want to be, but it's not so much happening. And then there's the trust issue. It's really important to decide when you have a claim coming at you whether to trust it or not. I thought a lot about that. What do we use to decide when something is coming to us as a claim, whether to trust it? I think there's three obvious things and one not so obvious that actually is really looming large. The obvious ones are you want somebody who has integrity, right? You want to know this is an honest source. Maybe they have some tradition of being honorable and honest. You want them to know what they're talking about. Competence. You want them to be an expert that has, really studied the issue and not just tossed off a comment on Facebook that sounded good. And you want them to have humility. I think that's pretty important. You don't want an expert who's an expert on everything, because nobody can be an expert on everything. You want somebody who says, here's my domain. Here's what I know about. I'm going to tell you the best I can what to do in that space. But don't ask me about that other thing, because that's not what I really know a lot about. We do a lot of blurring there, don't we? Celebrities who suddenly become capable of being an expert on almost everything. Be careful. But then what's the fourth one? The fourth one right now, which has become so large, is does that source align with my values? And if we are all separating off in our tribal gatherings, and we seem to be doing that, then does that mean you're not going to trust anybody who's not in your bubble? In which case you've greatly restricted your sources of input, and you've maybe granted too much trust to somebody in your bubble who may not know what they're talking about. But they kind of mesh with your priors, and so like, okay, I guess I'll take that on board. We're doing a lot of that. And the consequence of that is gradually eroding our ability to build up the things that are good for us and that are true and reliable, and instead building up things that have a much shakier foundation. And that's very much what we see right now. So those four critical components, truth, science, faith, and trust, where are we now? And now I do have to come to my own experience. Having served as the director of the NIH in January of 2020, when a terrible pandemic was clearly getting underway in China and heading for us, it was my job to make sure that we were doing everything we could in medical research to respond to that, even before it was clear how bad it was going to be. In 48 hours, after on January 10th, when the letters of the code of SARS-CoV-2 were posted on the internet, so we knew what its DNA sequence was, we had designed that first vaccine. It was the vaccine that became the Moderna vaccine because of the people who had already planned for that, had been working on this technology of mRNA vaccines for 25 years, and were ready to say, okay, let's do this. In another 60 days, the first patient was being injected with that test phase 1 vaccine. That had never happened in less than 6 months. And then we got to the big, really significant trial, what's called a phase 3 trial. So think about how you have to do this. You want to know, does this vaccine work or does it not? The only way you can really be absolutely sure is what's called a double-blind randomized control trial. We signed up 30,000 people. God bless them. They were willing to take part in this experiment. And they said, you will not know whether you got the vaccine or a dummy shot. And the people giving you the shot don't know which one it is either. It's all barcoded and nobody knows the code, except for at the very end, you can take off the blinders and see what happened. So those 30,000 people, who were very diverse and ranging across age ranges, agreed to take part. And then you have to watch over 3 or 4 months to see who gets COVID and how sick do they get. And there was that moment, late night in November, where the blinders were taken off. As a person of faith, I had prayed about this a lot for all of 2020. And the answer was astounding, because most vaccines fail, and the ones that succeed rarely are better than 50 or 60% in their efficacy, and many of them have terrible side effects. And this was 95%. That was true for the Pfizer, that was true for the Moderna. And the side effects in those 30,000 people were pretty much negligible. We later found out there were even rarer side effects you wouldn't have found in that group, like the myocarditis that happened with the mRNA vaccines in young men, although fortunately all of those were reversible. But this was such a moment. It was like, oh, do you remember 2020? Remember when 4,000 people died every day and nobody knew who was next? And then it seemed like we finally have something. We're finally going to be able to turn this around. And so the trucks rolled out with the vaccines and people rolled up their sleeves. And early 21, it seemed like the big question was, can I get access to it? And then you could. And by June, pretty much anybody who wanted a vaccine could get one for free. But something happened, because by June of 21, somewhere between 50 and 60 million people said, no, thank you. I didn't see that coming. I was of the mindset, which I now see is totally naive, that we humans are all rational actors, and that given data that you can look at, you're going to make a conclusion that fits the data. But a lot had happened by the summer of 21. People like me who were doing science communication hadn't necessarily done a great job of it. We had not really explained sometimes the uncertainties. And when recommendations changed from day to day, people began to doubt that we knew what we were talking about. And if that was true about one thing, maybe it was true about the vaccines too. So it was like, are they really that good? And then there was this deluge of misinformation coming from cable news and social media, which had all kinds of crazy conspiracies written into them. But after you hear them a few times, you begin to think, well, maybe they are true. Maybe there really is a chip in that syringe. Maybe for a person of faith, this really is something where there's fetal cells in this vaccine. Or maybe this is the mark of the beast, which was very much put forward in some circles. But the consequences of this is that good, honorable people hit with all of that information, uncertain about who to trust, said, no, thank you, I'll be fine. But then they weren't. The most heartbreaking statistic of this whole story is from Kaiser Family Foundation. And they looked at what happened between June of 21 and March of 22. So this is just about 9 months. And they calculated 234,000 Americans died unnecessarily because of misinformation. This is not just sort of a minor societal disagreement. This was lethal to 234,000 people. It's just hard to get your head around that. Major drivers of who were the people least likely to trust the vaccines were political party and also faith. The most unlikely to trust the vaccines were white evangelical Christians. I'm a white evangelical Christian. This breaks my heart. How could we have somehow taken what many, I think, would look at as one of the greatest achievements of science in all of history and somehow turned it into a terrible loss of life? We did save, in the U.S., 3.1 million lives. That's the guess. Maybe I'm one of them. Maybe you are too. We don't know if your life was saved, but that's the estimate. And across the world, it was probably more like 15 million. But there was this other consequence. So what happened to truth, science, faith, and trust? Well, truth got very blurred. Is it true that these are safe and effective? Science was doubted and, honestly, sometimes poorly explained. Faith perspectives, which you would have hoped could sort of step into the space here, were often overtaken by misinformation and sometimes by political messages. Politicians, in some instances, played a very unfortunate role in spreading misinformation. And trust was sometimes withheld from reliable sources and instead granted to unreliable sources. And the internet was an absolute cesspool of many of those kinds of claims, some from people who made a lot of money as a result. Wisdom was not achieved. People died. Looking at that, I just felt this can't be us. But what is it that we should all try to do as a response? So let me come to that, because I don't want to make this all sound like a gloomy, hopeless case. It's not. It's certainly a tragic circumstance, certainly a cause for concern, maybe even alarm. But there are ways that we can turn this around. So who is the audience I'm trying to write to? It's you. But it's about the people who I think have not yet bought into the extremist voices on the left and the right, which is still a significant part of our country. It's the exhausted middle. I'm part of the exhausted middle too, who are some blue and some red, and yet they're not taken in by the extreme voices, and they're actually kind of tired of all the vitriol and all of the finger pointing and the blaming and trying to figure out what do we do. But a lot of us sort of tempted to check out at this point because it's just so unpleasant. So is there something we could do, we the people, in this situation to try to see if it could be turned around? I don't think the politicians are going to help us. Every survey would say the politicians are more polarized than the American public. So they're pulling us apart, not pulling us together. Well, first of all, hope is a critical thing. And for me as a believer, hope is a big part of my faith. So let's not give in to the pessimism and the cynicism. We've had enough of that. But what can we do? Okay, here's the charge. And this is all in the final chapter of this book, chapter 6, sort of, okay, here is the action that can be taken. And it even gets to a pledge, which I'll come to in a second. First of all, we should all really re-recognize, if we had somehow gotten a little unsure about that, the truth really matters. It's truth. Ascribing to objective truth should not be optional. And saying that may be true for you, but it's not true for me when it's an objective fact is really not a position you want to take. So could we all start by maybe trying to get our houses in order? Distinguish more carefully the facts from the fakes. I love the story of the 5th grade teacher who, looking at all this, was concerned that we've lost some of our critical capabilities and basically began to challenge his 5th grade students to tell the difference between a news report that was factual and one that was a fake. And gave them a chance to sort of figure out what would be the criteria. And they got really good at it and loved it. Maybe we should be doing this in other settings as well, not just a 5th grade class. And for the rest of the year, they kept fact checking him and probably carried that forward for other things as well. So yeah, we ought to be better at doing that ourselves, looking at something and doing the analysis. Wait a minute, what's the source? How does this fit with integrity, with competence, with humility? And am I tempted to accept that source because it's somebody who has the same sort of biases that I do? Well, be careful then. If it's a fact, it doesn't care how you feel. It just is what it is. So let's get our houses in order, which means some critical thinking. But then also, the other major recommendation here is to figure out how we can reach across the big divides that seem to have separated us. We've stopped trying in many instances. It's just too unpleasant to sit down and have a real discussion with somebody who has a very different view than you do about something like immigration or abortion or gun control or public health. You just feel like, oh, this is going to be so unpleasant, that we've kind of lost our enthusiasm for trying. We have to try because that's the only way we're ever going to get back together again. I'm part of a group called Braver Angels that's trying to do this in a systematic way. They bring together people who are half on the blue side and half on the red side, and they pick a topic. And then everybody who's there gets to express their view about what they think is true about that topic, and everybody else had to listen. To the point where if it's not your view, you have to be able to say back to that person, here's what I heard you say. That means you really had to listen. This is marriage counseling for our country, really. And I've been part of at least a dozen of these sessions, and it starts off really tense. And people are like, I don't know if I want to be here. But then you really, when you start to listen where somebody's coming from and what about their background led them to that conclusion, you start to go, oh, I kind of get it. Yeah, if I was living in that situation, I might have that view too. And as the conversation goes on, the tension drops down a little bit. And then people actually begin to say, you know, I still don't think you're right about that, but I'm realizing there's something in my own position that maybe is not as clear as it should be. Maybe I've kind of taken on board a little bit of my position that I'm not sure is right. And then everything breaks open because everybody starts to realize it's okay to say you don't have a absolutely solid position on this topic, because too often we feel like we're stuck there. If I show any weakness, somebody's going to jump on me. We have to show some weakness sometimes in order to have a real conversation. So I've done a lot of that with Braver Angels, and it's taught me a lot about things like the public health response to COVID. And I can see a lot of things that happened that really weren't as good as I thought they were at the time. There was a lot of recommendations we made based upon what was happening in the big cities that really were not a very good fit for people out in the community. I will tell you, there's a particular public health officer that I learned a lot from who's been part of all this. It's your public health officer who just retired from Marin County. It's Matt Willis, who has, I think, been the model of somebody who's able to look at what's happening and all the data, but then say, but in my community, there may be a different situation here in terms of what is the right idea about when we can open the schools. And maybe it's different than what you would do in another place. We didn't do a very good job of that across the country. It was sort of one size fits all, except it didn't fit. And then if we can begin that process of building those one-on-one relationships, maybe then we can also map that across to larger gatherings. And maybe churches ought to be a wonderful place to catalyze that. And of course, other community organizations, and of course, our own democracy is the way in which perhaps as the voters, as we the people, we can begin to bring ourselves back to where we used to be. I think we did, where we can agree to disagree without being disagreeable. So the final thing I would say is in the last part of chapter 6 is an effort to try to convince you, not just to look at this and go, yeah, that sounds reasonable, but to actually decide to get involved. And that's a pledge that I would ask you to read carefully and think about whether that's something you would want to commit to. So you're really going to be part of the solution. You are going to look carefully at information and decide whether it seems valid. And if it doesn't seem valid, then don't spread it around to a lot of other people, because that's how these crazy viral things get started. And you're going to try to reach out to people who are of a different point of view and really listen to understand and begin to build that healing process. That's what the pledge is about. The pledge is posted on the Braver Angels website. If you just go to the internet and search Road to Wisdom Pledge, it'll take you to Braver Angels and to this very site. And if you're really interested, which I hope you will be, you can sign it right there and document that this is what I'm now determined to do. This is part of my commitment to try to see if we can bring our society and our world back to a better place. I didn't want to write this book, but I'm glad I have the chance to come to a place like this and talk about it. My spiritual mentor, Tim Keller, who died about a little more than a year ago of pancreatic cancer, held me accountable for following through on the initial instinct that maybe I ought to try to write something. So this book is dedicated to him. But I don't know whether a small voice like mine is going to affect the situation we're in, but it's too important not to try. So thank you all for listening, and I'd be glad to take your questions.
Thank you so much. So I have a mic. We're going to pass it around so that we can.
I'm not loud. Maybe I need to be closer to it.
Yeah, you just have to be a little closer. Thank you. Anybody want to start? Questions?
just mentioned your mentor, right? This way. Your mentor, Tim Keller. No.
It's not on.
Hello?
No. Ooh, did we lose a battery?
I'll just speak loudly. I can do that.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Oh,
Hello?
the magic happened.
Yes, you mentioned Tim Keller, and you can see I've read the book a couple times.
Thank you.
You mentioned on page 173 the Mind Project, and that really caught my attention.
Yes.
Do you know well, first, can you speak more to the project and what he was thinking about? And might there be a roadmap or an existing model that's already in place or that maybe you can further go to that seems to be a great scholarship for believers who are also medical practitioners, who are also people who are fatigued?
All of that. Yes, Tim Keller, in this final major writing that he did in the last few months of his life, the title of which is The Decline and Renewal of the American Christian Church, includes, among many recommendations, the development of the Christian Mind Project. You know, when Jesus was asked, what are the great commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind is in there. Your mind. If you go back to Deuteronomy, mind, it doesn't appear, but it does. And when Jesus rephrased it, we are supposed to use our minds. And so Tim, who is certainly somebody who used his mind a lot, was arguing that we have let that atrophy in the church. And you may have read Mark Knowles' various books about this. The original one is the scandal of the evangelical mind, which is there isn't much of an evangelical mind, which is a heartbreaking way to say it because he's an evangelical and is himself heartbroken when he says it. So Tim is advocating for it in the last few months of his life. Exactly where does that stand? I think there's a lot of interest in seeing that renewed. I would point to an example that I think is doing a lot of that, which I am happy to say I have a bit of a part in, and that's the BioLogos Foundation. How many of you know about BioLogos? A few of you do, yeah. BIOLOGOS. So it's a foundation which aims to bring together people who are very much attached to the importance of rigorous science, but who also are very much attached to very committed Christian faith and who don't see a conflict between the two, but who are also committed to gracious dialogue between those particular worldviews. BioLogos has been around since 2009. I will say I'm the founder, but I had to step away from it in order to be NIH director, and other people have carried it off wonderfully since then. And it is a place, I think, where this kind of Christian mind development has been going on quite vigorously. And now a couple million people are regular visitors, and there are conferences, and there's curriculum for Christian high schools and Christian homeschools to try to be sure that that all gets folded in. And efforts now on climate change as well, which is another really serious circumstance where science has a particular very compelling story to tell. The earth is warming at an unprecedented rate. That's not my opinion. That's the fact. And it's also extremely clear that that's because of human activity. And yet many people of faith are not quite sure about that. And certainly people who are perhaps in other ways promoting other kinds of energy don't want that to be true. So we have that issue too. That's part of the Mind Project as well. And Christians have a role to play in creation care. We are given the opportunity to be stewards of this planet. We should be carrying that out with responsibility. And yet churches oftentimes don't want to talk about this topic. We should be talking about this topic. Anyway, it's a bit of a long answer, but it is a critical exhortation from the Reverend Keller that has only partially been responded to, and more would be better. I'm with you.
So as I make my way over, I have a question.
You told me you would.
I said I have a couple, but so one thing is, how do you resolve the issue of discussing evolution, science-based evolution, with creationism? How do you reconcile? I know that's probably a really long question or requires a long answer, but maybe you can give a short answer.
I'll give the short version of it. So First of all, scientifically, and DNA has given us insights into this in ways that Darwin could not have possibly imagined. It is very clear that organisms are related to each other from common ancestry. The DNA language is right there to show us that, and that we humans are part of that too. From a biologist's perspective, evolution is just about as solidly backed up by experimental data as gravity is. But it's become this touch point for terribly difficult conversations in a lot of conservative Christian churches in a way that is uniquely American, by the way, and uniquely recent. Go back and read St. Augustine, who was obsessed about Genesis and what did it actually mean. And there's a specific warning in there about not interpreting Genesis as a scientific document because you might turn out to be wrong. And we seem to have done a lot of that. For me, I don't get it, again, because I didn't grow up in a conservative Christian church. I didn't grow up in a Christian church at all. So when I read Genesis, it's fascinating and wonderful in terms of what it teaches us about God and about us. But it doesn't read like a science textbook. And why one would need to turn it into that and then conclude that the earth has to be 6,000 years old when the data is just absolutely compelling from multiple different directions that it's really about 4.55 billion. So if God chose to create a universe with these remarkable physical laws that are beautiful and predictable so that everything sort of follows order, and in the process of doing so, put in place all of the opportunities for things to happen, including life, including us, big-brained creatures who would emerge with a hunger for relationship with that Creator God. Who are we to say that was a dumb way to do it? And yeah, it took a long time, but in God's mind, it's a blink of an eye. God's not limited in space or time. So I find this, and this is basically referred to, in the old days, people called this theistic evolution. That sounds a little bit pedantic. A better term, I think, is evolutionary creation. Creation's the noun. Evolutionary is the adjective. How did it happen?
Well, I have so many thoughts, but I'm thinking a lot about this disparity, the polarization in our nation, and have so appreciated your focus on that. And do you know about the difference course, Archbishop? Anyway, I can talk to you about that later. But there's so many people, Christians in different areas, working on just this problem. But one that strikes me when you talked about energy versus global warming, energy, people who have high stakes in maintaining, polluting, or globally warming energies. It seems like when we're trying to reach across the aisle, proximity is really critical. And that's the problem. Because when you look at red and blue, they're very geographically differentiated. So how does your group deal with that? Do they fly people in?
For the annual meeting, yes. Braver Angels, their meeting 2 years ago was in Gettysburg. That was supposed to be symbolic. And this year it was in Kenosha, Wisconsin, halfway between Milwaukee and Chicago. Think of that in terms of the Republican and Democratic conventions, also symbolic. So people fly in for that. I did. But there are local chapters, 100 of them, for Braver Angels all over the country. I don't know if there's one in Marin County, but I bet there's something not far from here. And they will not hold a session unless it's 50-50 red and blue. They just won't do it because that's the whole reason why they exist. And sometimes, depending on what zip code you're in, you got to really struggle to find enough to make it a balance. But they've managed to do so. And I think they're right to maintain that. And they would always say, we are not organizing this session on this topic to say who's right and who's wrong. That's not the point. We're organizing that so that people will actually listen to each other and have a better understanding of why other people don't see it the way they do and don't consider them to be demons, which we do too often. Yes. Yes. Yeah, there's quite a bit of that that's been done. I've been part of those as well. It's not quite as good as being face to face, but it does serve a pretty good purpose.
I
Yes.
have a question. I'm no scientist. I've just seen scientific programs about the discovery in humans of Neanderthal and other prehistoric standing people that we had relations with and kept going, that are in our DNA. How does all that do with Christianity?
That's a good question.
And the creation stories, which are two creation stories, and then God made humans, and the other one's the Adam and Eve story and all that. So how does that we've got all these pre-human genes or whatever it is in us?
Well, yeah, let's say, for instance, if you look at my DNA and that of a chimpanzee, if you look at the part that actually codes for the proteins, it's 99% the same. And that's not just me, that's you too. So, yeah, we are very much, we can discern that, a product of a long-term evolutionary process. But that doesn't mean that there is not a creative intention about humanity that's separate. We are still the image of God. When it comes to Neanderthal mixing, yeah, most of us in the room have maybe 3% of our DNA that's Neanderthal in origin. That would not be true of people who stayed in Africa because the mixing seemed to have happened. And others, the Denisovans. Yes. So there were other humans, humanoids, human-like, not just Homo sapiens, but what we ended up with is us. And we are all related as one family. That's one of the wonderful findings from the Human Genome Project, that all the Homo sapiens on the planet, we are all descended from a common set of ancestors. Science will not allow you to take racist attitudes toward other groups. We're all part of the same group. We all started out as Black Africans and then traveled around, and evolution did its work on us to select for certain properties like skin color and other things. The question about Adam and Eve is one that fascinates lots of people, me included. Were Adam and Eve literal characters, or were they intended to be symbolic in some way? I don't know the answer to that. It does sound like, even from biblical perspectives, that there were other humans around at the time that Adam and Eve were around, because otherwise, where did Cain find a wife? And what were all those people he was afraid of as he was building a city? It seems like there was a population at that point. So were Adam and Eve a unique couple chosen by God for the infusion of the fullness of the Spirit, of the knowledge of good and evil, the moral law? But others were around them at the same time, and they're becoming the first real Homo divinus, the real intention of God's image, began then to spread to the rest. I don't know. I can defend either one. And Tim Keller and I have argued about that for many years and never resolved it. God bless him. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Dr. Collins. I'm a volunteer advocate for the Alzheimer's Association, and
Thank you.
I've been in a room with you before in Washington, D.C., and I want to thank you for your leadership on advancing research when it comes to Alzheimer's. My question is about the scientific community and the support that you do or don't get from the general public. Is there something more citizenship could be doing to support the scientific community?
Well, obviously, I want to say yes, but it's not a good time right now. I think a lot of scientists are actually feeling a little embattled. I had the opportunity as NIH director to have other scientists who reported to me, one of whom was Tony Fauci, one of the most remarkable public servants I've ever known, who dedicated his entire 50 years at NIH to trying to do something to recognize terrible infectious diseases and do something about them to keep people from suffering. And now look where this has gone, because he's become a convenient person to blame, because he basically put forward information that certain people didn't really want to hear. And then all these conspiracies built up about what he was all about, which are completely without merit. And here's an 83-year-old guy who has to have 24/7 armed security, even now, to protect him and his wife and his daughters. That's just wrong. And yet other people looking at that, do you want to go into public health? Huh, is that what happens? So, yeah, we have, as part of the polarization, which sometimes just turns into meanness, that we have figured out ways to blame people who are really just trying to do their jobs. And that is really not who we are. That's not how we should be. But I guess, again, maybe in this book, I'm trying to go from things shouldn't be like this because they shouldn't, to I shouldn't be like this. What can I do?
I was just thinking about the Salem witch trial, and I grew up in Massachusetts, and we grew up hearing about it a lot and studying it a lot, and it almost seems like the human nature of people, they love to fear something.
Hmm.
The idea of fearing something that they can't control is there, and it seems like all these instances of the controversy about even the vaccine is the fear of something that we can't control and that we don't know where it all started and where it all came from, and everybody has a different story about it. So I think that's the difficult part about reaching people. I have a neighbor upstairs in her 90s, and she will not ever take a vaccine ever, and she's very strong minded about it. And she said, and I never got COVID. And she's very proud of that fact that, she didn't take the vaccine and she never got sick, while all around her, all the neighbors got it at one time or another, in different degrees.
Yes, the danger of drawing conclusions from a very small set of anecdotes. The plural of anecdotes is still not data. And so that's why you need double blind randomized controls. But that may not be an effective argument for your neighbor. I don't know. Yeah, we are wired that way. We are, particularly in a circumstance where there's a lot of uncertainty, then fear and anger will get our attention. And that's where social media has really done a lot of damage, I think, because social media is great at spreading messages that are going to make you afraid or make you angry. It spreads about, somebody says, 6 times faster than the truth. So it doesn't take much. And again, that's why I'm hoping people will stop their tendency to hit that button and send that off to the next 10 people if it's not true, because so many of those go so fast. Yes.
So this is a bit of a follow-up on that, because I do a lot of my science communication on social media to combat that. And some of the work that we're doing at Hopkins is on the distinction between trust and trustworthiness, and how to demand trust on a untrusting or distrusting community is putting more labor on communities who might be hurt by really real harm from the past, whether it's anything from Tuskegee to just racism in the in the context. And so to flip that and say, what do we do as scientists and science communicators to be worthy of that trust? Yeah. There's some patterns of, kind of taking from psychology, repair in the form of saying, we don't know, or we don't know yet, or, we were wrong, perhaps. So I'm curious in your experience in this work of repair, because there is a bit of a death of expertise now. What are some best practices that you've seen to be worthy of trust instead of demanding the work on communities to be trusting?
No, really good points. And I think you've already articulated much of what I would say. And what I've learned is every time one makes a recommendation based upon what is admittedly imperfect science, because science is moving along and learning as you go. That was certainly true during COVID. We should say that. We should say, okay, here's what I'm going to tell you I think is the best recommendation that we've got right now, but there's a lot we don't know. So trust me, if you will, that I'm not trying to put one over on you, but also believe me when I'm not sure that what I'm going to tell you is going to turn out to be right a week from now. So if it changes a week from now, don't be too surprised. But for right now, if you want to try to keep yourself safe, here's what the experts would say you should do. We didn't do all of that preamble stuff. Yeah. And so no wonder people heard this recommendation from CDC or from me, and then a month later, it was the opposite, maybe about masks. And they're like, these people don't know what they're talking about. Maybe they're even jerking us around because they're having fun. And then you lost them. So no, that really critical. And especially with communities that already have had a pretty negative experience about trusting in science and medicine. You mentioned Tuskegee. That always comes up, and it should, because that was a terrible abuse of trust.
That was a really good point that she mentioned, and I had thought about that as well, that it seems like before COVID, there wasn't the same distrust or animosity towards the science community. I mean, I'm sure there was Tuskegee, there were other incidents, experiences that people had that were very negative, but it felt so much more intense during COVID in a partisan way. And I guess I'm just wondering if you can talk about that a little bit, the partisanship of it.
That is an unfortunate part of the way things played out. Again, our polarization has been very much tied to politics. And it almost was, okay, if the other party says X, then I have to say not X. And so if the other party is saying trust vaccines, then I have to say I don't trust vaccines. Right. And it almost turns out, when you look at the polarization and how that's affected science, that many things that are just facts are very much treated differently depending on which party you align to. Ironically, the Republicans, who in the past, and I've been around a while, were often the ones standing up for rigorous science, are now just statistically more likely to question a scientific result. Whereas the Democrats, who in the past were, I don't know about this, seem to have aligned themselves more on a statistical basis, not everyone. So what is this about? This is like a set of facts that have nothing to do with politics. And yet it's become one of the prime determinants about whether you accept it or not. This is not the way we're going to find our path forward to a healthy nation.
You said an element of the road to wisdom was deciding whom to trust.
Yes.
It seems to me one of the really baleful developments in the country has been the discovery that people prefer to listen to sources that are biased in the direction they already tend. And that's true at both the blue and the red side. How can we go about reversing that baleful trend?
I agree that's a baleful trend, and that's very specifically addressed here as part of how we got into this difficulty and what we might try to do about it, which is, again, to be more self-aware when information is coming at you that seems like it might not quite add up, but it's from somebody who's in your own circle. Well, you might just take it on board anyway. Don't do it. And again, your tendency to discount information that is coming from a different group when it's perfectly reliable. Don't do that either. Stop and say, wait a minute, this is really not about my bubble. This is about whether this is true or not. Is this a fact that I can basically see the evidence for from a source that is actually got expertise and integrity and humility, and I should believe it, even though it may come from a group that I normally wouldn't mix with. We've got to get past this. I'm totally with you. That is a big part of the trouble we're in. And it's that fourth part of trust, which is aligned values, which you might think was a good thing, and it's turned out to be a dangerous thing.
We'll take one more question.
I work in science education leadership for California, and I loved the start of chapter 3 where you described being turned on to science by an activity that you did in class. And then I also really appreciated at the end the ways that you talked about what we can do in education. And I'm wondering, from your vantage point, specifically for science education, what do you think we need to add or shift or amplify as we go forward?
Great question to finish with. I fear that science education, like much of education, is so much geared towards how you're going to do on the test that it skips over the critical thinking part, which is really what we need a lot of now. And that would be true not just in science, but maybe especially in science. I would love to see a science curriculum that actually walks students through particular claims about something that was purported to be scientifically accurate and throw some in there that were really not and help students and all of us begin to tell the difference. What are the warning signs there that a particular claim is simply not going to stand up when you look at it closely? And how do you sort of improve your muscles for recognizing that so that you don't get taken in? But that can apply, of course, to other parts of education. Shouldn't we? We don't teach civics much anymore. But if we did, a big part of it ought to be, how do you evaluate what's being stated in a political speech as whether you can actually say there's truth there or not? There's a lot of untruth out there now, but there's nobody really calling it out the way that they should. If we're going to have a future generation that's going to do better, maybe they need more of that kind of opportunity to think critically, to have that kind of formation of their own abilities more finely tuned than what we currently give them, where it's more regurgitating information, which frankly is all stuff you could look up anyway. Don't get me started on education. It just seems like we are missing an opportunity here to get the next generation in a much better place than we are.
So I said last question, but I want to end this on a question from one of our viewers on Zoom. How strong is your optimism right now?
It's very strong, but I'm an optimistic person, and I'm also a follower of Jesus. And so I'm feeling like this is not just up to me or any of the rest of us to have this end up in a place that we could feel hopeful about. That's part of my faith. But I can look around me and I can see things happening that give me encouragement. I talked about Braver Angels quite a bit as a movement here to try to, and that's not the only one. There are multiple of these bridging organizations. I think they're doing great, good work. There was recently, speaking of faith, a statement that was signed by more than 300 leading pastors and theologians, basically a conviction about what it means to be an evangelical, which basically said, what have we been doing, attaching ourselves to all these political perspectives that are the opposite of the Sermon on the Mount? Let's bring ourselves back to what we are supposed to be. That was wonderful. It's a great statement. It's got about 7 points. It's only 2 pages. And if it were even more broadly endorsed by the church and then acted upon, would give me great hope. So I am optimistic, but I'm also anxious to sound the alarm that this isn't going to get better just because, we want it to. We got to work at it.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to our online audience. Thank you to our